In the first letter of Paul to the church at Corinth, chapter 15, verse 14, he writes this: "If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." Now that's a risky statement. Think about what Paul gave up in order to preach the gospel. He gave up his way of life, the respect of those people that he had grown up with. He stepped away from all the accomplishments that he had under his belt. As a zealous Jew who persecuted the Christians, he chose to follow Jesus, and then he gave all of his energy and risked his life countless times in order to get the message out throughout the empire. And yet he's saying, everything that I value, everything in which I've invested my life hangs by one thread, and that is that Jesus was raised from the grave. And if he wasn't, then everything that I have done, everything that I have preached is useless, and your faith has absolutely no value whatsoever. So you can see that this would be a very important thing for Christians to understand, for Christians to be able to grasp and to embrace this belief that Jesus was raised from the grave. But I've discovered over the years, working in the Anglican Church, that many Anglicans simply don't understand the resurrection. They don't understand what it means. They don't even know the details around the story of the resurrection of Jesus. And for something that is so important, upon which we base everything, it's a little scary to think that we know nothing, or very little, or perhaps our beliefs are kind of scrambled and may or may not be true. So what I'd like to do in this series is talk about the resurrection. And I know that different preachers will have different points of view. But I'd like to share with you my understanding of the resurrection and give you enough information that you can draw your own conclusions. But one thing I will tell you definitely, and that is that this belief is critical. If we cannot believe that Jesus has been raised, then we might as well walk away from him altogether. So this week we're going to start in our journey learning about the resurrection by asking ourselves, what's the story? Now, I've said that many Anglicans don't understand the resurrection, cannot really explain what it's all about, and really don't know the story. And I don't blame them, actually, because it is very confusing when you look at the New Testament accounts. What I'd like to do is just look at some of the details of the story of what happened when Jesus was raised. If you were to ask most Christians to summarize the Easter story, what happened on that morning, they would say something like, well, some women came to the tomb where they had laid Jesus' body. They found that the stone was rolled away, and there was an angel there who declared that he was not in the tomb, but he was risen. Now, they might be able to go on and give a few more details, like the women went to speak to the disciples, to tell them what they had seen, and they came to the tomb to confirm for themselves. They might have other details, like there were guards at the tomb. But it may surprise you to know that this summary that most Christians would give is contradicted by the New Testament itself. So what we're going to do is look at a few of the details as told to us by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you can decide for yourself whether they agree with each other. First of all, we can say that women came to the tomb and witnessed that it was empty and the stone was rolled away. But this is what Matthew says in chapter 28, verse 1. After the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descending from heaven came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. So you've got two women. You've got Mary Magdalene and another Mary, who is not named, who come to the tomb, and there is a great earthquake. And then an angel comes down from heaven as the earth is quaking and rolls back the stone in front of the tomb. Now, let's go on to Mark chapter 16, verse 1. This is how he tells it. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. Now this is a very different story. Matthew doesn't say that they were coming to bring spices. We always assume that that's why they came, but Matthew omits that detail. And also, Matthew does not tell us about Salome. Now, Mark agrees that Mary Magdalene was there, and Mary, the mother of James, so he's naming the Mary that is not named by Matthew, but then he adds Salome as well, so there are three women, not two. And they've come to anoint the body of Jesus. And then in Luke chapter 23, verses 55 to chapter 24, verse 1, it says, "The women who had come with him from Galilee followed, and they saw the tomb and how the body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath day they rested according to the commandment. And on the first day of the week at early dawn they went to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared." Well, Luke is very different. He says the women, so that could very easily be Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome. But he says that initially they came and they actually looked inside the tomb and they saw where the body was laid. That's not given to us by Matthew and Mark. And then they returned and prepared spices and ointments when they got back to wherever they were staying. And then they came back again, and on the first day of the week at early dawn, they went to the tomb with the spices. So Luke is going into a lot of detail about these spices and how they went home, they prepared them, and they brought them to anoint Jesus' body. But now look at John chapter 20, verse 1. He says, "Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb." So John has now taken Mary, the mother of James, and Salome out of the picture, and he's chiseled it down to Mary Magdalene. She is the one who came to the tomb. No indication that she came initially and then went back home and prepared spices and then came to anoint the body. But she made her visit on the first day of the week while it was still dark. And there was no earthquake, no angel that came down and moved the stone, but we're told that she came and saw that the stone had already been removed from the tomb. A lot of details are in disagreement here. And secondly, I don't know if you noticed this when I went through those 4 accounts, but there's some disagreement as to when the women actually came to the tomb. According to Matthew, the visit was made toward the dawn. And then Mark says it was made very early when the sun had risen. So not toward the dawn at all, as Matthew says, but rather after the sun has risen. Luke says it was at early dawn that the visit to the tomb was made. And then in John's Gospel, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark. So there's no indication here that it was on the cusp of dawn and it was about to get light, or that dawn had already broken. Rather, it was still dark. It was nighttime. So they don't seem to be fully agreed on when it occurred. Now there's some general agreement here, of course. It's on Sunday morning that the women come to the tomb. And you might say, well, so what's the difference if they get that minor detail wrong? But I'm just pointing out they do get it wrong. Now, number 3, you may have noticed that so far we haven't been talking about guards at the tomb. And I always think of the resurrection as being a stone rolled away from the tomb, and a guard has, or guards, plural, have been at the tomb guarding it, and now they've run away in terror, perhaps because of the angel who came down and caused an earthquake. But it's only Matthew who mentions guards. The other 3 Gospels don't seem to have any knowledge of them at all. The tomb is unguarded. And number 4, did the women enter the tomb? Well, according to Mark and Luke, they did. They went into the tomb. But according to Matthew and John, they didn't go into the tomb, so they didn't confirm for themselves that the grave cloths were lying there and Jesus' body was gone. Okay, so there's some division here between those Gospels that believe the women went into the tomb and those that believe they didn't. But what about the disciples, the male disciples of Jesus? Well, Mark and Luke are strangely silent about the disciples going into the tomb. As a matter of fact, you may remember that Mark ends his gospel with the women running away in terror after they had discovered that the tomb was empty. And that's the end of the story. But it's only Matthew and John who say that the disciples went into the tomb. And then number 7, do you remember the part of the story where Jesus said that he couldn't be touched? But as we look more closely, we find that Mark and Luke are silent on this particular subject. But in the Gospel of Matthew, the women grab the feet of Jesus without any protest from him. It's only in the Gospel of John that Mary Magdalene is told not to touch him, and a reason is given for not touching him. So there seems to be a bit of a contradiction there. How about the angels? Well, in Matthew 28, we're told that there was one angel, and this angel descended from heaven after the earthquake and rolled away the stone. So one angel outside the tomb. Let me read that to you. Suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord, descending from heaven, came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. That's an interesting detail. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. That's a pretty detailed description. I mean, if I was a police detective looking into this case of the missing body, I would find that that's a pretty detailed account. Might get the sketch artist out to maybe create a sketch based on this description. But in Mark's Gospel, we're told that there was no angel that came down from heaven. There was no earthquake, but rather there was just one young man inside the tomb. It doesn't say he was an angel. Just one young man was inside the tomb. I'll read this. When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side. See details again. He's wearing a white robe and he's sitting on the right side. It's almost as if it's a detailed first-hand witness account being given to us. We're told that they were alarmed, but he said, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place where they laid him." Now, that's interesting because when I was going to Wycliffe College, there was a great big painting that used to hang in the chapel, but which now hangs in the refectory at Wycliffe. And it's of the angel at the tomb. Now, the angel being depicted is grand and glorious with wings, and he's pointing up at the sky. And he's outside the tomb. And he's saying to the women, obviously, he is not here, he is risen. But in Mark's account, that's not what we're being told. It's a young man who is sitting inside the tomb. And he says, he's not here. Luke chapter 24. We're told that not necessarily any angels, not a young man sitting inside the tomb, but rather they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body. And while they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. So now it's 2 men in dazzling clothes, and they're standing beside the women. And then finally, John's Gospel. What does John have to say about the angels? Was there more than one? Were they inside, outside? Did they have wings, or were they just described as a young man? Well, John doesn't know anything about angels. He doesn't mention them at all. We're told Mary Magdalene came to the tomb, saw that the stone had been moved from the tomb, and so she ran and went to Simon Peter. Now, I would have thought that if angels were present at the resurrection, that would be worth mentioning. You know, if this was a historical fact, if we were to take the story literally, surely this would be something to put down on paper. It would only take an extra line to say, and there was an amazing angel standing there in dazzling robes. But John seems to have no awareness whatsoever of an angel or a young man inside or outside of the tomb. And then finally, number 9, how long was Jesus on earth after he was raised from the grave and before he ascended into heaven? Well, the usual answer that we would give, I think just about everybody in our church would give this answer, would be he was on earth for 40 days. And at the end of the 40-day period, he ascended into heaven. But what's interesting is that in Luke's Gospel, there is an apparent discrepancy. In Luke chapter 24, verses 50 to 51, it says this, and this, by the way, is on the day that Jesus was raised from the grave, Easter Day. Jesus led them out as far as Bethany, He lifted up his hands and blessed them, and it came to pass, while he blessed them, he was parted from them and carried up into heaven. So everything takes place in the course of one day. The resurrection of Jesus and his ascension into heaven. But we believe that Luke wrote the Acts of the Apostles. And in Acts chapter 1, verses 3 and 9, Luke seems to contradict himself. He corrects what he says in the Gospel, and he indicates that Jesus was on earth for 40 days before his ascension. Okay, so there are some of the discrepancies between the four Gospel accounts. You may consider some important and some not so important. But people react in different ways to these differences once they become aware of them. I know that many critics of the Christian faith, people who are part of the New Atheist movement, for instance, will often talk about the discrepancies, the differences between the Gospel accounts, the way they contradict each other, and say that this is proof positive that you cannot believe the Bible. It's just a mishmash of contradictory information. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have those people who are literalists. They believe literally every word of the Bible. They don't necessarily believe that God dictated the words of the Bible, but certainly they were inspired and verified as true by the Holy Spirit, every single word. And the literalists, I've seen many attempts that they make to try to explain why these contradictions are not really contradictions. It actually all comes together quite nicely, but when you look at their explanations, it just doesn't have the ring of truth. They really force it. For instance, John is the only one who says only Mary Magdalene came to the tomb. And when you read his account of Easter Day, I don't see any room for the other women, the way he tells the story. This is an intimate encounter between Jesus and Mary as he speaks her name and she comes to believe in him, and he tells her not to touch him, something which he doesn't say elsewhere in the other Gospels. It's like the same theme, but a different story altogether. So I don't think the literalists are right, but I also don't think the critics of the Christian faith are right either. This is how I see it. And I hope I'm not rationalizing. I'll leave that for you to judge. But it seems to me that these Gospels were written a long time after the events. The earliest Gospel may have been written 20 years after the resurrection of Jesus, but that's debatable. It might have even been later. The latest Gospel may have been, John may have been written 70, maybe up to 90 years after the resurrection. And so they're relying on second and third-hand accounts, traditions, stories. And when several decades have gone by, it's highly unlikely that the disciples are going to remember exactly what happened on that day. So there are going to be differences. And also, as stories get told, passed on from one person to another, they get changed. Sometimes an exaggeration or an embellishment, or maybe something the storyteller doesn't like. He takes it out to fit his point of view. And that's how oral tradition works. So you might say, well, so you throw it all out then. You can't trust it. But I would say this. Isn't it interesting that despite the lapse of time, despite the disagreement over details, they seem to all be agreed that the tomb was empty, the stone was rolled away, and that afterwards the disciples, beginning with the women and then the other disciples, all had a life-changing experience. Whereas they had been in grief and unconsolable, aimless, not knowing where to go next, what to do next, suddenly they were galvanized, they had a sense of purpose, and they had a very clear and very strong message that they took out to the world. What happened? Something happened, surely. That cannot be explained as they all got together and conspired and made up a story. And if they had done that, then we would have had the same story in all four of the Gospels. They did not conspire. They didn't collaborate to write this story. They were changed. Their lives were turned inside out and upside down, never to be the same again. And I find that the differences between the Gospel accounts, the disagreements, make that point better than anything else could. That the tomb was empty, the stone was rolled away, and something burst forth that transformed the lives of these simple folk. I hope you stick with me for the rest of the series. Have a great week. Enjoy this beautiful weather.